It's 8 a.m., and the precinct is already buzzing with the usual noise. Officers gossiping, joking, and barely paying attention to the door. Then a man steps inside. No uniform, no badge, just a regular guy walking through the door like he's on a coffee run. They don't even blink. To them, he's just another nobody. But they're wrong. That nobody, he's the new chief. And what happens next? It's going to change everything they thought they knew about this job. It was a hot and muggy Tuesday morning in August when Richard Nelson, the new police chief, arrived at the Blue Ridge precinct. At first glance, he didn't look like the type of person who would completely change the department. He wore a plaid shirt, old jeans, and beat-up sneakers, more like someone's neighbor than a veteran cop with over 20 years of experience. But beneath that casual appearance, he had a plan. Richard was there to see what the precinct was really like, to understand its true culture. The department had a reputation for shady behavior, with rumors of corruption among its officers. He wasn't going to make a big entrance like most new chiefs. Richard was going to blend in, stay unnoticed, and see things for himself. He parked his car at the back of the lot, scanning the area as officers went about their day. Some gave him a casual nod, while others barely seemed to notice him. No one knew who he was, not yet. Richard adjusted his baseball cap, took a deep breath, and braced himself. This was going to be harder than anything he'd ever done before. As Richard walked into the precinct through the side door, the noise hit him immediately. Phones ringing, officers talking, papers shuffling. The floor tiles were clean but cracked, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. It felt like just another normal day at the precinct, or so it seemed. Richard moved through the lobby, taking it all in. A few officers leaned against desks, sipping old coffee and joking around. He didn't know who to trust yet, but he didn't need to. He wasn't there to make friends. He was there to observe. He headed toward the break room, where laughter echoed off the walls. As he was about to walk past, a voice suddenly called out, "Hey, you!" Richard turned slowly. A tall officer with a cocky grin stepped toward him. His badge read, Officer Daniels. "Lost, are you?" "This isn't a shelter," Daniels sneered, giving Richard a once-over. "You need to take that mess somewhere else." For a moment, Richard stood still. The officer's words stung, but he didn't react. This was the test. Should he fight back or stay quiet? Daniels didn't wait for an answer. He stepped closer, getting in Richard's face. "Didn't you hear me? Get out of here. We don't need people like you around." Richard's heart raced and the laughter around him grew louder, but he held his ground. He wasn't there to back down. Then, out of nowhere, Officer Daniels spat in Richard's face. Richard froze for a second as the spit slid down his cheek. The laughter around them turned into mocking chuckles. His mind was racing. He wanted to shout, to retaliate. But he stayed calm. Not yet. With deliberate control, he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his face, ignoring the feeling of disgust. He looked Daniels in the eye and spoke, his voice steady. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Daniels just sneered, still oblivious. "Only the ones who don't belong here." Richard didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked away, leaving the officers behind, still laughing. But deep down, something inside him began to shift. He hadn't expected this, and neither had anyone else. Time seemed to stretch. Richard stood frozen for a moment as the warm spit slid down his cheek. The laughter around him got louder, more mocking, and crueler. His mind raced. He wanted to yell, to fight back, to hit Daniels, but he wasn't here for that. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. With calm, deliberate movements, he wiped his face. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his composure. He wasn't going to let this get to him. Taking a deep breath, Richard finally spoke, his voice steady but intense. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Officer Daniels sneered, still wearing his cocky grin. "Only the ones who don't belong here." Richard didn't flinch. He didn't move. He didn't react at all. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Daniels and the others behind. The laughter started to fade as he walked out of the room. But inside, something began to change in Richard. It was small at first, but it was there, a quiet, simmering anger beneath his calm exterior. He wasn't going to let this go, not this time. A few moments later, Richard stood at the back of the briefing room, watching officers file in. He could still hear Daniel's insults echoing in his head, but he pushed them aside. It was time for the next step. Captain Harris, who had led the department through some of its toughest times, cleared his throat. "All right, everyone, we've got an important introduction today." Richard's heart raced, but he kept his face calm. This wasn't about making introductions or being friendly. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to make a point. Harris went on, explaining that Chief Caldwell had retired and that Richard was now in charge. He handed the microphone to Richard. As Richard stepped forward, he could feel every eye in the room on him. Daniels was in the back, arms crossed, still wearing that smug grin. Richard met his gaze for a moment, and for just an instant, Daniel's smile disappeared. Richard took the microphone and spoke calmly. "Good morning, I'm Richard Nelson. I'm your new chief of police." There was a long pause. No one said anything. Daniel's cocky expression was gone. Richard could feel the tension building in the room. "Earlier today, I came in wearing plain clothes to see how things really run around here when no one thinks they're being watched," Richard continued. "And let me tell you, what I saw wasn't pretty." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Some of you thought it was funny when Officer Daniels spat in my face. Well, let me remind you, it wasn't just me he disrespected. He disrespected the badge, the oath we all took, and the people we swore to protect." The room felt heavier now. Richard stood at the front, watching his words sink into the officers like stones dropped into still water. The room was charged with an energy that hadn't been there before, an uneasy energy, like everyone was waiting for the next move. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Richard didn't look away from Daniels, whose face was still a mix of disbelief and anger. The man had no idea how to process what had just happened. But Richard did. He knew this moment was a turning point for the whole department. "Let's be clear," Richard said, his voice calm but sharp. He didn't need to shout. His words were already commanding enough. "This department has lived under a cloud of corruption, misconduct, and a culture that's gone unchecked for too long. Officer Daniels is just one example of the rot that's spread here." There was a shift in the room. Some officers looked away, a few stared at their shoes, but most of them could feel it, the moment that things were no longer business as usual. Richard wasn't here to play favorites or sweep problems under the rug. He was here to confront the truth. He paced slowly, letting the weight of his words settle in. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. "If any of you think this is just a slap on the wrist, think again," Richard continued, his eyes scanning the room. "This is a warning to everyone here. I will not tolerate disrespect. Not from anyone. Not from the lowest rookie to the highest-ranking officer." Daniels was shifting uncomfortably now, his face pale, eyes darting. Richard could see the tension building inside him, the realization that this wasn't just a minor incident. This was a shift in the power dynamic. Daniels' bravado was gone, replaced by the fear that Richard was in control. "You don't get to wear the badge if you treat others like that," Richard said, his tone final. "And, for the record, what happened earlier wasn't just an attack on me. It was an attack on every officer in this room. It was an attack on the oath we all swore to uphold." The silence in the room was deafening. You could almost hear the officers' thoughts racing, some likely questioning their own role in the toxic culture Richard was talking about. From now on, if you disrespect your colleagues, if you disrespect the public, if you break the trust that comes with this job, you will be held accountable. Richard paused for effect. "This department is going to change. I'm here to make sure of that." For a long moment, no one spoke. It was the kind of silence that screamed louder than any words could. Even Daniels, who had been the loudest voice in the room just hours before, was now silent. His confidence was shattered. Richard continued, his voice firm and resolute. "You're all on notice. Officer Daniels is suspended while we conduct an internal investigation. If any of you think this kind of behavior is acceptable, you need to reconsider your position here. Change is coming, and if you're not on board with that, this is not the place for you." The officers in the room shifted uneasily, but no one dared speak. Daniels stood there, his posture slumped, his face crimson with a mix of humiliation and anger. Richard's words had landed like a punch to the gut. And then Richard did something unexpected. He softened his tone, just slightly. "For those of you who want to be part of this change, I'm ready to work with you. But if you're going to keep making excuses or turn a blind eye to what's happening here, don't waste my time. I don't need yes-men. I need people who care about this department and who care about doing things the right way." For a brief moment, Richard's gaze softened as he met the eyes of the officers who were still standing, waiting. There were no more laughs, no more jokes, just the weight of his words hanging over them. He could feel the shift in the room. It wasn't all positive. He wasn't that naive. Some officers would resist, some would fight him every step of the way, but there were others. He could see the subtle nods, the flickers of understanding, the ones who knew that something had to change. Richard stepped back from the podium and looked at Captain Harris. The captain had been quiet the entire time, but now he met Richard's eyes with a look of silent approval. It was clear to him that the new chief had taken control of the room. With a final glance around the room, Richard said, "I'll see you all at the next briefing. Until then, think about what I've said. This is your chance to step up. Don't waste it." As Richard walked out of the room, he could almost hear the murmur of the officers behind him, whispering among themselves. Some were angry, some were confused, but Richard knew that change was already underway. He had made his stand, and now the hardest part was just beginning. The real work wasn't in the speeches. It was in the choices each officer would make in the coming days. And he would be watching. The days that followed were filled with a tense energy. Richard knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but he could already feel things starting to shift. Officers who used to ignore Daniel's actions now started to whisper to each other, thinking about their own part in the unhealthy culture. One morning, Officer Reyes, a young recruit, came up to Richard. "Chief, I was part of the problem. I saw things and didn't speak up, but I don't want to be that person anymore." Richard nodded at him, his expression both kind and firm. Standing up is never easy, but it's the only way we can move forward. Weeks passed, and the precinct started to change. It wasn't perfect, but it was definitely better. Richard's presence reminded everyone that accountability wasn't just a word. It was something they had to live by. One evening, after another long day, Richard sat in his office, reviewing reports. The phone rang, and when he answered, it was Captain Harris. "Chief, I just wanted to say, what you did today, that was leadership." Richard's heart swelled. It wasn't just about suspending one officer. It was about setting a precedent, about building a culture. "Thank you, Captain. But the real work starts now." Years later, as Richard prepared to retire, he looked back on the transformation he had led. The department was far from perfect, but the progress was undeniable. Officers who couldn't adapt had moved on, and a new generation of recruits who shared his vision were now in charge. At his retirement party, Officer Reyes, now a sergeant, gave a speech. "Chief Nelson showed us that leadership isn't about power. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's the hardest thing." Richard smiled, his heart heavy with pride. He had left his mark, and as he looked at the officers gathered in the room, he knew the department would continue to move forward, because it wasn't about one person, it was about all of them. And as he walked out the doors for the last time, the precinct felt different, safer, more human, more hopeful.